and sustain a community that is racially, culturally, socially integrated, and truly inclusive, where there is equity and equality for all. To that end, the schools committee's goal is that the school district is stably integrated overall within levels and schools, and the staff is racially and culturally diverse, where students of all races are expected and encouraged to excel. To further our goal of supporting integrated schools, the Schools Committee, along with President's Council, is proud to present this evening's program. We will begin this evening with Zoom basics from our amazing Zoom host, Tegan Kohler, followed by my co-chair, Jocelyn Ryan, who will give a brief overview of the evening and introduce our moderator. And again, thank you all for your patience.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you again for sticking with us. For those of you who are not spending all of your time on Zoom these days, we do a little bit of basics. It sounds like everybody has gotten the memo. Please do mute yourself when you are not speaking, and thank you all for doing that. We really appreciate it. To help us create a community feel, we invite you to turn your camera on. If you experience any technical difficulties, you may go into your chat feature at the bottom. It looks like a speech bubble, and search for my name. It starts with TEG, and just send me a private chat and I'll do my best to support you. You can also click on my image, although I think we have a lot of people to scroll through, so your better bet is probably to look through at that chat feature at the very bottom and type in my name. Our session in plenary today will be recorded, and by participating, you give us your permission to record. We will not be recording things in the breakout rooms, and we will remind you of this when we go into the breakout rooms. And finally, as your questions arise during our speaker presentations tonight, we invite you to please do ask them, and you can do that very easily by typing them directly to me at, again, Tegan Kohler, using the chat feature, and all you have to do is search for my name and send your question directly to me. And now I'm pleased to turn things over to Jocelyn Ryan. Jocelyn?
Thanks, Tegan. So I'm going to go through this really quickly because it's there on your screen. I'm going to introduce Dr. Anderson. She's going to introduce the topic. We're going to hear from students from our partners, the Youth Collective, and then Julie Snyder will speak. We'll do breakout rooms, come back, have a Q&A, evaluation and closing remarks. And now it is my very great honor to introduce Dr. Adney Slackman Anderson. Adney is a career educational leader. She has served for over 20 years as a principal for the Montclair Public Schools and for 10 years as lower school head primary school director for Kemp Place School in Summit. Adney lives with her husband in South Orange with a family legacy in the community that began in the early 1900s. They have 2 grown sons. Adney holds a BA, a Master's, Advanced Studies in Learning Environments, Educational Psychology and Human Development, a doctorate in Education Management, Leadership and Policy. She is now pursuing a postdoctorate specialization in positive psychology. Her dissertation was on school choice selection and preference among African American parents and caregivers in an integrated magnet school district of choice. So you can see why we chose her for tonight. We could talk about Adney. I feel like we should have a whole separate evening just talking about Adney and how lucky we are to have her in our community, but I'm gonna move on. She has won 1 more awards than we have time to list, among them the Geraldine R. Dodge Fellowship Award in Leadership, NAACP Excellence in Education Award, Regional Magnet School Principal of the Year Award. She's also a former coalition trustee and executive board member. So straight on to Dr. Adney Slackman Anderson.
Well, thank you so much, Jocelyn. Such a lovely introduction. I appreciate that. And good evening, everyone. On behalf of the President's Council of the School District of South Orange and Maplewood and the South Orange Maplewood Community Coalition on Race, it's my pleasure to serve as your moderator for this evening for tonight's program, Roadmap to Equitable School Integration, Lessons Learned from Nice White Parents. So, full disclosure, in setting the stage for this evening, please know that the Coalition School Committee has an explicit goal that Carol has already shared with you. I would like to add that this year they have one very broad and very specific objective, and that is to engage families, parents, and students to be advocates and to increase family awareness about the benefits of social integration for all children. So that's what brings us here to this evening. Set against the backdrop of the New York Times 5-part podcast, Nice White Parents, we are continuing to set the table for your involvement, for your engagement, and for your advocacy for educational equity and excellence in the South Orange Maplewood Public Schools. So let's see what lessons can be learned. As a former career principal, I too shepherded a school community of teachers and parents and students through the March 2019 pandemic shutdown. I virtually held hands through the new normal of emergency remote learning and remote living, and reimagined preparations for a safe, healthy, and trusting reopening of schools under either an in-person, virtual, or hybrid model. And if you recall, the season of COVID-19 brought to consciousness for some, although not new to others, an increased level of awareness, being woke, about the many pandemics facing us locally, nationally, internationally, and globally, including racial inequalities and injustices, economic, public health and educational disparities, food, technology, and housing insecurities, and myriad other issues related to social justice and human rights. During this pandemic season, I found that there were two very well used popular phrases at the time. The first, you're on mute. You're muted. Unmute yourself, or some variation, some mutation. And the second, these are unprecedented times. And indeed, these are and remain unprecedented times as we all continue to navigate the new reality. I often say that we may all be in the same storm, but we are in different boats because we each have a story that others know nothing about. We are all in different boats with a unique set of family, economic, emotional, and educational circumstances. So I try to be keenly aware of that. So whenever given an opportunity to speak with a group of community members and especially a group of parents, which I am assuming that most of us are, I like to begin with a wellness check-in about you, your children, and your extended and immediate circle of family and friends. So consider this my wellness check-in. And I also like to give a shout out, an acknowledgement to each of you as parents, guardians, teachers, administrators, community stakeholders, and especially our students, our young people, your children, who have shown and continue to demonstrate incredible perseverance, flexibility, optimism, energy, nimbleness, tenacity, hope, agility, expertise, and grace. And I encourage you to keep that list in mind as you and your families and the community prepare for two very significant school district dates. The first is the reopening of schools, which I know is on your mind. The return of school phases are slated to begin Monday, April 29th, consisting of a combination of learning options, including virtual, in-person, hybrid, cohort days, abbreviated weeks, and asynchronous Fridays. Admittedly, there is no handbook for parenting during these unprecedented times. Just be encouraged to embrace and steer your boat through this continued storm, doing the best that you can. After all, and let's take a collective inhale and exhale, we are in a pandemic, the same storm. So do the best that you can and remember to look for the silver linings and choose to bring your best self to each day. The second date, projected for September 2021, launch is one of the district's highest priorities. The true integration of the South Orange Maplewood schools. It's my understanding that this follows multiple presentations, symposiums, events, and conversations with experts, outside consultants, district administrators, teachers and staff, community stakeholders, and each other. As well, it's my understanding that it follows an invitation from the district superintendent to adopt a growth mindset. I call it a can-do commitment regarding the mission, the vision, the beliefs, benefits, and relevance of intentional integration. And this is not, it cannot be one-sided. In theory and in practice, the research supports that children who learn in diverse, balanced, mixed environments are more likely to develop a broader, more inclusive mindset, as well as cognitive, emotional, and social capacities that increase their abilities to grow, to learn, to work and play in meaningful ways and at the highest levels among those who are most like and most unlike themselves. So in continuing with tonight's program, I'd now like to introduce to you two students, Ella Remy, a senior at Columbia High School, and William Nash, a junior at Columbia High School, who are representing the newly formed Coalition's Youth Collective. The Youth Collective is a youth group made up of high school and middle school students from South Orange, Maplewood, and neighboring communities who use art as a catalyst to deepen understanding and surface solutions for integration and social justice issues. Please welcome Ella and William.
Hi everyone, my name is Ella Remy. I'm a senior at Columbia High School, class of 2021. I'm a part of MAC, which is the Minority Achievement Community, which is a platform for minorities within our high school to achieve in our studies and get opportunities that we wouldn't have gotten. I am also thoroughly involved with our performing arts at Columbia High School. And now introducing Will.
Hi everyone, my name is William Nash. I am a junior at Columbia High School. I am also part of NAC, and I'm also part of the performing arts programs as well as the lacrosse program. So I'm really excited to be here and talk to you guys about this very pressing issue.
So starting off, integration starts with our elementary schools. The achievement gap primarily starts with our 5th grade placement, which leads us into our placement and leveling for our middle school classes. So within Columbia, the higher the level, it seems that the less the minorities, which is a huge problem. And since with the schools that primarily are minorities, like some of the elementary schools, they have less likely to have equal opportunities for their education. So the lack of opportunities and resources aren't given to them. So that's something that we are hoping to fix.
Yes, like in terms of the class sizes, a part of the AP classes and the honors classes, especially in Columbia High School, the amount of people of color is very minimal. In a class of about, you would say 25 to 30 kids, there are about 2 to maybe 5 that are people of color. And that all stems from and starts at the lowest levels in elementary school, when you kids are in the 5th grade going into the 6th grade, leveling for the math class they're going to be in. I remember when I was in the 5th grade going into the 6th grade, and we were doing the testing to do the leveling on if you're going to be in 6th grade honors math or 6th grade regular math. My teacher pulled me aside and was telling me how she felt like I wasn't going to be able to be in the 6th grade honors math class. And me being a Black male in the class of mostly white children, I went to Jefferson Elementary School in Maplewood. And it was kind of like, why is she saying this only to me? And I talked to my other white friends, she didn't say anything about that to them. And it was just really like, to me, like that can really hurt a child's ego. That can make them think, well, I don't think I'm good enough. And that could go into the conversation of how a lot of students in Columbia High School and in the middle schools, how they feel like, oh, well, the honors classes and the AP classes are only for the white kids. And only the white kids can raise their hands. And even some of the high school teachers, they make it seem like it's so like outlandish and so astonishing when a person of color is articulate and can raise their hand and be the top out in front in the class. And I feel as though this all plays intertwined together. That means teachers stemming from from kindergarten all the way up to the 12th grade, teachers all need to be ready and know what to say to their kids. And also that also stems from having the right balance and also the right support for these students to know that they can do that. Because like that's what MAC tries to do. Like MAC is an organization that really tries to reach within the middle school and the elementary schools to let these kids know that you can be the best child in the classroom. You can do it. Like, don't let anybody tell you. Because there was a time in Columbia High School when the guidance counselors weren't really like open to any person of color moving up to the higher levels. Like my sister, she graduated class of 2019. When she was in her sophomore year, it was a struggle. It was a fight in order to get into the AP classes and into the honors classes, because I guess it was the stigma of Black kids don't do well, and that needs to be changed from the lowest level all the way up. When I was in middle school, it was just like, you could see that like the kids that were in each class, because I went to Maple Middle School, and the kids that were in each class were so different, and the kids that they put into math and the English enrichment classes were all people of color. So all that plays into each other. I just feel like as a district, we need to be very conscious, and we need to do better in giving support to our children and to our students of color, and letting them know that, you can be in those art classes. It's not hard. You can be the front runner of the class. You can raise your hand. You can be the smartest kid in the room. So, yeah.
Yeah. And the biggest thing that Will and I are trying to get through is that just brushing off the idea of that Black students can't be higher up. Just giving equal opportunities, equal tutoring, equal field trips, like just all of those things, because they all matter. And like Will said, they do affect your ego and they do affect your mindset. Like, oh, I can't be an AP. What am I talking about? Why would I sign up for that class? Like, we need to erase that mindset that starts in the elementary schools. So.
Well, thank you so much for that powerful testimony. Clearly, we have our marching orders, and I know that the schools committee that serves as a watchdog is committed to making those changes. But I applaud both of you, and I thank you for your leadership and your perseverance. And keep that can-do spirit, keep that can-do attitude, and hopefully we will be able to turn this around. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ella and William. Can we give them a virtual acknowledgement? Those on the screen. In fact, I'm going to send you a heart if you can see my picture.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. No, thank you very much, Remy. And thank you very much, William. So as we continue to foster an open mindset, that can-do spirit, and I think we just had an example of how the can-do spirit can move us forward. But as we continue to keep that open mindset, around intentional integration within our schools, I'd like for you to keep some words in mind. Words like integration, segregation, desegregation, inclusion, equity, equality, caste, intentionality, access, belonging, justice, and interest convergence, just to name a few. There's a truism that says the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I'm reminded of the Sankofa, a word in the Akan, Twi, and Fante languages of Ghana, West Africa, that translates to mean to retrieve, to go back and get. San, to return, ko, to go, fa, fetch, to seek and take. And Sankofa is represented by a mythical bird flying forward with its head turned backward, meaning to learn from the past in order to ensure a strong future. So this evening, as Soma schools and families prepare to engage in intentional integration, once again, we set the stage by taking this opportunity to look forward and to look back in order to go forward. At 50 years of attempted integration at one Brooklyn school, and we asked the questions, what can be, should be done differently? Our featured speaker this evening is Julie Snyder. She is the co-creator of the podcast Serial and S-Town, the executive editor of Serial Productions, which is a New York Times company, and drum roll, the executive producer of Nice White Parents, the 5-part podcast series about building a better school system and what gets in the way. Also of note is that Julie is a neighbor, a community member. She lives in Maplewood, where her children attend the South Orange and Maplewood schools. Here, with lessons learned, as the community embarks on the path to equitable school integration, I present Julie Snyder. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, that's so kind of you. Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. Thank you all so much for having me here. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about the podcast and talk about the show. I will, I appreciate that maybe not everybody has heard the podcast. So I'm going to try and kind of thread the needle a little bit of kind of for the people who haven't heard it and the people who have heard it, just a broad overview. Hold on, I want to change. So I'm not looking, okay, good. Now I'm not looking at myself, sorry. I just wanted to give you guys kind of a broad overview of the podcast. It's a 5-part podcast about tracing the 60-year history of one public school in Brooklyn, a middle school. And it's tracing the history of the school and its relationship with the white families in the district and in the zone for the school. And it's hosted by Hannah Jaffe-Walt, who is a longtime education reporter and has done mainly radio reporter for This American Life, where I've also worked for a long time. And I thought I could talk tonight about the process of putting together the show lasted about 5 years, not full time, but from beginning of reporting to the end of releasing it was about a 5-year period. And I thought maybe I could talk with you guys a little bit about the evolution of the show and my personal experience of being the editor and the producer on the story while I was also a parent in Maplewood South Orange schools. Because it definitely, over the course of doing the reporting on the story and finding out both what was happening in this school, but also the history of this school, I started recognizing a lot of, I started recognizing myself basically in a lot of my own behaviors, but also my experiences in the schools here, and recognizing myself as a nice white parent as well. And to begin that kind of, I could talk a little bit about the focus of the show and the title of the show. The idea of nice white parents was essentially, it wasn't the original focus that we thought we were going to do the show about. That kind of evolved over time. But what we mean by nice white parent is essentially was me and Hannah. The idea of white people who believe, committed to equitable public education for their children, for other people's children, wanting an integrated school. But basically, what kind of like role do those parents play in public education? We felt like we had kind of talked a lot in education and talking about education reform, about the roles of lots of different stakeholders, but hadn't necessarily put a lens on the way white families and white parents shape public education. So I can kind of walk you back a little bit to when we first started the show and started the reporting. We began in 2015, and what we were looking for at the time was we wanted to look at a school that was actually going through integration. That is not common. There's not a legal mandate. Not many places do that and mandate education. And at the time, though, there was more discussion about schools were resegregating, and so like how were they basically going to diversify schools was like a lot of the words that were used at the time, and mainly being done through choice because we couldn't find a place where they were mandating it. So choice was basically being done. People could choose a lot of the different schools and their options. And the idea of, at least in New York City, in order to integrate schools that had been historically segregated, basically the approach the city was taking was to offer various different programs, amenities, things that might actually basically they were very geared toward, and sort of explicitly so, toward white families to get them to come into schools that had been historically segregated. And I will say, like, we kind of we approached this with skepticism, I would say, of how this was going to go. But we wanted to see a place that was trying it and see how would this work if integration was done through choice as opposed to being something that was mandated. And so Hannah found a school in Brooklyn in Cobble Hill called the School for International Studies. That was its name at the time. It had many names over the years and many marketing campaigns over the years. But at that point, it had started as the School for International Studies. And it was in a building in Cobble Hill, which is a pretty affluent neighborhood that the white families in the neighborhood had largely ignored the school for the previous 40 years. It was a very segregated school that by 2014 their population was really shrinking. They were not winning in the choice wars. And so the previous year, when Hannah was there, they only had 36 graders in their 6th grade class, and largely Black, Puerto Rican, and Middle Eastern students. And the year Hannah went there, there was a huge influx of white families that had decided to send their kids en masse to the school. And it was interesting, just that alone, watching when Hannah began to interview the families to find out, like, well, why are you guys choosing SIS? What was making them choose was actually nothing really about the school. It was about what was going on outside of the school, which was at the time, there were 3 middle schools, and I guess they're referred to as the Big 3 in Brooklyn, in that district in Brooklyn, that were the most popular middle schools for affluent white families. And they had become incredibly competitive to get into. And to the point where white families were being disadvantaged, and they felt being disadvantaged, that they couldn't get into the schools that they wanted to get into. And so they had to start looking for other options. And so a group of families, they sent out like a survey monkey to each other and kind of basically decided, if we do this all together, do you guys all want to go to this SIS together? One of the things that drew them, or that they were looking for, is that their kids had come from an elementary school, a public elementary school that had a French program, a French foreign language program. And so they had asked the principal at SIS, would you be willing to put in, if we can raise the funds for it, would you be willing to put in a French program for the middle school? And she said, sure, yeah, we can get the money for it. And so that brought in the families. So they went from 30 students in the 6th grade class in 2014 to 104 students in the 6th grade class in 2015. And that growth in population was almost entirely white students. So that's the first episode of the podcast. And that was the first year of reporting that Hannah did, was reporting on what happened that year. And that was when I began to start recognizing, honestly, like some uncomfortable truths of my own experience with sending my own kids to the school. It wasn't like a mess of a year that Hannah reported on. One of the main places, though, that she found that where there was conflict pretty quickly was about like who gets their voice heard, power, and fundraising. And those three things were all very tightly wound together. Fundraising became like a huge focus kind of very quickly. And I think, there was an existing PTA at the school. They had done largely just kind of community events. They hadn't raised a ton of money in the previous years. With the new parents that came in, they were coming from an elementary schools where fundraising was just, kind of the New York City turbocharge. The people here even gasp about, people raising $600,000 for their kids' elementary schools and stuff. So those parents were coming from that. And I think just we're kind of like, that's what we're here for. We're here to make the school better and raise money and bring in resources, raise money for the French program. But, this school has been neglected. They haven't had equitable funding. This is one of the things that integration maybe should be bringing, is you're bringing in the money that might follow the white families that are coming in. And I think there are two main characters in the first episode, and one is Amy Hernandez, who was PTA president, had been at the school. Her kid had been at the school for a while, and then a guy named Rob Hansen, who was one of the new parents, a white man who was coming in. And he was also a professional fundraiser. And watching the way that Amy and Rob just the distrust that existed there, as I think the parents, the existing parents, or the old parents, as they kind of even referred to themselves, were saying, like, we want money, like we recognize we want money and we need resources, but what is it? Who's it going to? And that wasn't really articulated and never really made clear to anybody. So it's like, who's this money for? Is it for all of the kids? Is it just for your kids? And then, who gets their voices heard? And I think the whole thing ends, the first episode. It's a fun episode if you listen to it. I mean, in a ridiculous sort of way. The whole thing ends with a crazy scene at the French embassy, like the cultural arm of the French embassy on the Upper East Side, where they're having a giant fundraiser and then celebrating their diverse school. And it's a little disheartening, I have to say, when you listen to it, but it's also kind of ridiculous and sort of fun. But one of the things that really spoke to me about it was recognizing I had been a parent. My kids now are in high school. I've got a senior and I've got a sophomore in high school. But back, when they were in elementary school, my kids had gone to Seth Boyden. And, you know, it's a similar dynamic of where I came into the school. You know, Seth Boyden is a majority Black school. It's a choice program. It's opt-in. It's trying to basically get people to opt in is how you get the school integrated racially. And when I went to Seth Boyden, I wouldn't say like, I wasn't like the extreme, the people in Brooklyn were pretty extreme, the $600,000. I wasn't like going there, but I kind of also I just thought, oh, I need to be involved in school. I'm supposed to be a parent that helps out and stuff. So fundraising. And I just immediately assumed that was what my role was at the school. I joined the PTA. I took on a job. I became the ice cream social coordinator, but assumed that I'm supposed to be raising money, right? I'm supposed to be bringing resources to the school, but I never asked a question. I realized once I was watching what had happened with the Brooklyn parents, I never asked myself, what was here before me? And I think I acted as if I was like in a vacuum. Not only who were the parents like immediately before me, or what was a kind of immediate history of the school, who was already at the school and running the school, but also like historically, what was I bringing with me? And that wasn't something that I questioned. I also didn't really associate money with power. And of course, I mean, we live in the United States. We know this. We know that power follows money, or money follows power, or whatever, but they're closely tied to each other. And I didn't see the fundraising, and I didn't see those roles in that way. And so yeah, when we started working on Nice White Parents that first year, there were a lot of, I had like sort of uncomfortable moments of being like, oh my God. And I think the thing that struck me the most from that first year of reporting, that probably gave me the most pause or the most concern, was actually the kids in the school. A lot of our focus in the show is really about the parents, is about the role of the parents in the school, and a lot of times with administrators. It's adults. We don't talk about kids a ton in the show, except in that first year. There was a question that Hannah had, which is there was sort of fighting a bit, or polite fighting going on between the parents and the PTA and the fundraising. And she did wonder, like, well, does this actually mean anything? Does this really affect the kids though? Or are these just like kind of bruised egos among adults? And she began to interview the kids. And that was a part that really struck me, was a parent had told her that she thought that there was a real feeling in the school of of basically colonialism, of the idea that the new white families had come in, that this school had been broken, this school had been bad. It was a bad school. They had bad test scores. They didn't have a lot of money. And then now these families have come in and they're making this a good school. And I did pull, this is one cut of tape, and this is the one that kind of like always stuck with me the most, is where Hannah went and talked to, she finds a group of 6th grade boys, and they're like 11 years old, white boys who were part of this influx of the family, and kind of wanted to, or of the new families, and kind of wanted to know, like, were these the lessons that they were learning? Was this the message that they were taking away? And so she asked him about the school and what he thought of the school, what he thought the school was before and what he thought of it now. And so if you guys want to hear this part, this is what he had to say.
The kids wouldn't pay attention, and they had got to zone out every little thing. And I bet they learned very little. And now with this generation with us, I think we're doing a lot better. And I think that we're learning at a much faster pace.
He and his friends, they've turned the school around. That's what he's learning.
It's going to be one of the top choices already in the book, like when you're applying to middle schools, you get a book sort of on statuses and stuff. And I think this school is actually really high up in the statuses.
That was the name of the episode that we called it, was the book on statuses. There's not a thing called the book on statuses, but there is, he's talking about like kind of there's a directory of schools, you know what I mean, to guide parents to all their different choices, and breaks down like the whatever, all the data and information about the schools. And what I thought was sort of, first of all, at that point when she was interviewing him, they were like 3 months into the school year. So there was no new data about this school. It wasn't like there were like new test scores that the kids hadn't even been tested. You know what I mean? There was nothing new about the school. What was new about the school was that there were white families present, and immediately the narrative then changed in his mind. And I think that was an idea that the other kids were also absorbing, and they were absorbing that message. And that, I think that's what I started to really think about in terms of my role and the role that I was playing in the schools, and what were my kids learning in Maplewood South Orange schools? What messages were they getting? What messages were kids of color getting from the role of also how white families saw themselves in the school, what they thought as their role, and like kind of who got heard and who got listened to. So those were interesting, in that, and largely it was sort of from beginning that reporting. We did that first year, and then very quickly after that, Hannah started looking into the history of the school and discovered that so many people talked about this year was the first year that white families had shown an interest in SIS, which had been known as 293, back to its founding in the late 60s. And Hannah had gone to the Board of Ed archives to look up the history about the founding of the school, and actually found that the founding of the school was actually with the purpose of it being an integrated school. At the time, this was just coming off of Brown v. Board, and a combination of that, the civil rights movement. There were a lot of Black and Puerto Rican families had huge civil rights protests in New York City to integrate schools and demanding equal education. And so New York City did not really respond much to it at all, and really did pretty weak efforts to it. But one of the things that was part of a tentative plan were things called fringe schools, where they would locate a school in what was called a fringe neighborhood, where it was between, like, kind of equally located between two segregated neighborhoods, with the idea that would then they could integrate the schools. And that was actually the founding of the school. It was placed strategically in an area to pull in white families that were sort of, it was right on the border of between, like, Cobble Hill and then the Gowanus houses, which was a new housing, it wasn't that new at the time, but kind of new at the time, housing project. And what Hannah had found in the archives was a bunch of letters from white families at the time demanding that the school be built there, that they wanted a fringe school, and using all of the language of, of the civil rights movement, basically, and of integration, of saying, like, we demand an integrated education is the best education, and we demand that, and please build the school in this location. And then, so Hannah reached out to, she tracked down as many of the letter writers that she could find from these white families to ask them about their experience at the school in the early years. And every single person that she tracked down said they didn't end up sending their kid to that school when it opened 5 years later. And that was fascinating to us, was like all of the, we're basically all of the, that's when we decided the nice white parents, the idea of white families who basically use a lot of the language of equity and of equality and, like kind of from the civil rights movement, and yet abandon like those principles, but abandon them and don't support them. And that was kind of a question for us as we thought, well, now we want to actually look at the whole history of the school, because if we're realizing, like in 2015, how the school was shaped by the desires of white families, and we're learning in 1969 how the school was shaped and why it's located where it is because of the desire of white families. What was the role of white families as the school went on? Which was fascinating, because largely the school, if you looked at it from the outside, largely the school had operated for many years as a largely segregated school, and that it just didn't seem like white families were present in the school. But when you looked at the history, you saw the choice, the way that the district, the Board of Education in New York City and the district overall was making choices, and who they were listening to at the time, how that affected the school and why and how the school was operating. You got a much fuller picture by basically asking, where are the white families and where is their role in the school? I think for me, again, one of the things that was that as we started going into the history of the school, that I really related to my experience in South Orange and Maplewood was basically, I would say almost like the way the notions of integration were framed. In New York City, historically, as we laid out in the show, obviously there was Brown v. Board of Education was a legal decision and a legal mandate for unequal, there were unequal resources, unequal teachers, unequal facilities, outcomes in every way, and mandating equal education. And what I thought was really interesting was, at the time, New York City, their response to the Board of Education, their response to Brown v. Board was like, we're for it, we're totally for it, we believe in education, of course we're New York City, I mean in integration, we're New York City, we stand for all of these same principles. But in reality, they had not only horribly segregated schools, but I mean, to an extreme degree. There's a part of this a Black mother who had her children in the schools in the 60s in Harlem. We have an archival interview with her, and she's fascinating, actually. If you look into May Mallory, she became a really interesting activist and civil rights leader. But at this time, she was sort of still just at the very beginning, and her kids were in the schools in Harlem, and her kids they were going to schools in shifts. They were running 2 and sometimes 3 shifts a day because the schools were so overcrowded. The teachers, they didn't have like credentialed teachers. The bathrooms were like, ugh, the facilities were horrible. The kids just weren't reading. They just literally were not learning how to read. And this is at the same time that the city was saying, like, we believe in integration, while also keeping zoning laws and school zones very tightly controlled. And you had the schools in Harlem right next to zones on the Upper West Side of white children who were getting all the resources. May Mallory sued. She did win. And what was interesting, I thought, was watching what happened right after that was there was a very decidedly almost marketing campaign in a way, of where the Board of Education began to change what the word integration meant. Instead of saying, talking about basically tying integration to resources, to outcomes, to funding, to basically equal education, it became much more about multiculturalism and a celebration of diversity. It became a moral thing as opposed to a legal thing. New York City released these videos of showing like multi-racial classrooms, of celebrating diversity, while ignoring at the same time the extremely unequal outcomes that they were having. And in the interviews, May Mallory had talked about, like, the reason I want integration, I don't care about this is not about my kid sitting in a classroom with a white kid. I don't care. What I want is I want my kid to have the same resources that those white kids have. And the only way I see it happening is if my kid's in the schools with them. And New York, what I thought was very interesting about the multiculturalism thing was that at the same time, I thought in Maplewood and South Orange, there was a lot of talk about diversity. And I do feel like here we do live in a very diverse community, but there's a lot of, as if that's the end goal of just being kind of in a place together where you can feel good about that without actually looking at outcomes. And I appreciate, like, you know, with Ella and William talking about like what's happening in the high school and talking about, you know, you can point to very, very specific real things. I think a lot of us are really aware. In the high school, you've got all the kids are together. There's no more, it's only one high school. Everybody has to go to school together. But if you actually looked at data and outcomes, you've got, yeah, what's happening in AP or honors classes, what kind of outcomes are happening for kids of color? What are you seeing that is coming through with leveling? And I think that was my experience of working on Nice White Parents and going through the history, was saying like this idea of like sort of a celebration of multiculturalism oftentimes can be the thing that makes you sort of, it becomes a moral thing and not a thing of where you're really looking at like kind of hard at outcomes and what is really the goal. So those all were really interesting experiences as we did the show. And then I'll just kind of wrap up the last parts of Nice White Parents, as we traced through the history, was honestly just watching as the school went through many kind of changes, and it got broken up into small schools, and it got broken up into like, now it's a magnet school, now it's an art school, now it's a culinary school, now it's all the different things that they got that where that choice brought in as they started to have to compete with one another. And one of the things I just really took from that was a lot of those changes. Hannah found and interviewed a lot of people. A lot of those came from white families, white parents who were saying, we want better options. And so often that we had 3 examples in the show over the history of the school of a single white parent saying like, I just think that the schools aren't so great. I want a better option for my kid, but I want a better option for all kids. I want a child-centered curriculum. I want something that is multicultural. I want something diverse. I want something, and would build, and because their voices are heard so much more than the parents of color, the largely Black and Latino parents that were in the school, who were saying like, basically, we want you guys to stop siphoning off our gifted kids to gifted programs. We want to run our own like arts programs and have funding for that. Like they were asking for resources for their schools that they weren't getting, while at the same time, it was interesting to watch as like sort of white parents would open these like boutique schools around inside the same building. It's a little hard to explain, but anyway, by the end, there's like 4 schools going on in this building, including a charter, that were all done at the behest of white parents that don't then really have a commitment to the school and to staying. And I think that was something that I've thought about here. It's just like, as I've watched there, I do think sometimes like that I've recognized like that I make demands, and that I sometimes put or I have goals, or I have needs or something like that for my own kids, and start to put that into the language of like, well, maybe this is what's best for all kids. And I think I started to recognize when that would happen, because of the work that we had done on Nice White Parents, that oftentimes the white parents, what they want and their needs and their desires, of course, everybody wants a good education for their kids, and everybody's got specific things that they want for their kids. But a lot of times with white families would wrap it in global language of this is what's going to be the best for everybody, and get heard. And get their changes made. Whereas I don't think that the same benefit has been afforded to Black and Brown families, oftentimes when they express their needs and their desires, it's seen as individual needs that are there to serve their, the thing that they specifically want for themselves. And it's something I've been trying to be kind of more aware of in terms of my role in the school. And sometimes it gets confusing to me because I start to think like, well, maybe I should just shut up and sit back. And so it's been a little difficult. And it's something I still struggle with after doing the podcast, is just kind of trying to figure out like, what is the role and that I should be playing in schools or not as a parent. But anyway, that's like essentially like kind of where I ended up at the end of doing Nice White Parents. They do, the history of the school kind of goes all the way through to they're doing integration efforts now. They actually are doing mandated integration, which they just started last year in that district in New York City. That would have been interesting to watch and see how it goes. It really got, then COVID hit. So who knows? I think it started in the fall of this year. So I don't know. It's a little hard to assess how that's going in New York. But anyway, that's basically kind of what my experience has been. And I think one of the main things that I've been really struck by is just being able to be here with all of you guys and talk about this, and the fact that everyone does seem to be really interested in talking about building more equitable schools. It seems it's exciting, and thanks.
Well, thank you, Julie. And certainly, William and Ella charged us, and your presentation also charges us. And if people have not seen Nice White Parents or actually listen to the podcast, I encourage you to do so. But now we're going to break into groups and take this information and give our audience an opportunity to interact with one another. Let's see, what else is she saying here? So basically, that's the main question, Julie, for you. What role can parents play in particular in preparing children for integrated schools? Any thoughts?
Oh, I don't know. I think one of the things that I did notice, or one of the things that I've thought about, this would just be, and I'd be curious what you guys think. But sometimes I'm not sure if we've all come to a shared agreement about what's the purpose of school, and what are we building together? Why are we putting kids in school? Why do we have public education? What are we trying to achieve? And sometimes I think that if we got to a point where we maybe defined those things, like, is it, learn a trade and then be able to support themselves and become a functioning member of society is one way. There's another way of where, sort of the Horace Mann idea and the founding of public education is the idea of like, it's teaching us how to live in a democratic institution. And sometimes I just wonder about that, of like talking about that with each other, ourselves, defining it, if that's what we all agree that is the purpose of public education, but also talking to our kids about it. That's what you're supposed to, it's not about getting a job or getting into college or getting a job or getting those things. It's a bit about, it's more about like where we're learning how to live together and share decisions together and share a space together and be a democracy. I don't know. That's just like, that could be grand. I really don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Thank you. So here's a question from another group, which raises a question of who are we talking to and who are we not talking to? How can we make the effort to hear people we don't usually talk to? And I have the advantage, of course, of reading all the chats. And I think that question is so important because one other question was what happens when teachers are faced with children of color in their classrooms in a way that they were not in the past, which raises a question about what people are actually experiencing within our schools. So who are we talking to? Who are we not? And how can we make the effort to hear people we don't usually talk to? certainly events like tonight is one where the audience is the choir. And so how do we reach those who aren't here? Any thoughts, Julie?
One of the things that's interesting from the report, and again, like I can kind of only talk from my experience of the reporting that we've done and what I've seen and learned, but was the experience of the parents who were trying to organize in the final episode of Nice White Parents, a group of white parents had been sort of inspired by the idea of, you know, fighting for integration and integrating the schools, saying that, like, definitely noticing that the schools in Brooklyn, their kids' schools weren't integrated. And so they really kind of took that on of saying, like, we need to demand this. And one of the things they, in so many ways, were just like every white parent that had come before them in our reporting, in terms of like the 50 years back of sort of like both having like a singular idea, thinking that it's good for everybody, and then kind of having the confidence to try and make it happen, and then having the power and having their voices heard of actually becoming listened to and sort of catered to. But one of the things that they did that was different from their predecessors was they got to a point where they realized they were only talking for themselves, and that they were white parents. They tried to diversify the group and make it a broader coalition, and they failed miserably. And I admired, or I thought it was interesting that they stopped. What they decided to do was stop, like that we can't go forward because who are we speaking for? And we're not, and I do think to an extent, like I think for them, they felt like we're not in the right position to be able to put together a broader coalition. And frankly, that's something that the school should do, and that they're the institution that has the authority. They have the relationships. That's the role that they can do, to reach out to everybody and to try and kind of create a space where you could have like sort of a democratic space of a lot of voices being heard. There was a lot of skepticism of the parents of color, had a lot of skepticism when the school approached them. They hadn't had great experiences. They hadn't felt like they'd been heard by the schools for the previous 50 years. Why would it make a difference now? But with, you know, like a lot of persistence, there was like some movement. And I think it just was the kind of thing that over the years, and trust, and you have to keep on committing to that relationship. Hopefully they can have it. But I think that was kind of an interesting takeaway, was that they stopped when they realized that they weren't speaking for everyone.
Yeah, because certainly there are many sides to this piece, and we need to hear from more voices. Julie, given what you know from your Nice White Parents research, what do you think is the most important thing that SOMA can keep in mind as we move forward as a district with integration? Or what do you think is the biggest pitfall?
I think from what I've seen, kind of what we had looked at from the reporting and the patterns, that probably one of the biggest pitfalls is exactly that, is just a lopsided power structure. And it kind of seemed like that kind of kept on replicating over the history of the school, and not taking responsibility for the outcomes, like the whole community, like the whole institution, everybody didn't take responsibility for the outcomes. And so I think that would probably be something for us to be definitely aware of, that there's just like that we live in the world, the same power dynamics that exist everywhere else, of course, exist in the schools as well. And to try and, I think, like democratize it as much as possible, have outcomes based, like really look at outcomes and everybody take ownership for them. They're not somebody else's problem. They're everybody's problem. Those probably be the things that I saw over history weren't acknowledged.
Mhm, mhm. Okay. So in the chat, we have quite a few statements, and just piggybacking on something that you were alluding to, one statement is that I think many Black parents, oh, I lost it, are at best, I keep jumping around, sorry. I think that many Black parents are at best ambivalent about the idea of integration because historically, integration has meant sacrificing their political power and putting their children's bodies and spirits on the line to try to appeal to white humanity and compassion, which inevitably does not work. So I think that kind of captures some of the things you were saying too.
Yeah, and it was interesting with Nice White Parents of when in their integration effort that when they did reach out to parents of color, a lot of the reason that parents weren't joining in too was that they were really ambivalent. They didn't really care about integration. Like that was not their big priority of the way that their kids were being served in schools. There were definitely special ed was like a really big issue in a few of the schools of saying like that we just like those resources were not being delivered to their school. Overcrowding in some schools, just saying like we just way too many kids and the facility is falling apart. The building itself is falling apart. So it was interesting of saying like integration a lot of times, yeah, like whose priority is it?
Right. Because in response, I guess, to the little dialogue we just had, the response is, but Black parents are very clear. And mind you, I'm trying to be very objective here, but Black parents are very clear about the ways that proximity to white resources can make a tremendous difference to their kids' outcome. And so I think it goes to the heart of the question that reasons for integration and what Black parents and what white parents may value or not about integration varies. So there's the need for that conversation. There are a lot of questions about or concerns about teacher professional development, wondering are teachers partaking in diversity training to be able to learn how to communicate and teach children of different backgrounds, races, etc. Just putting kids in a diverse room isn't the only way to solve the issue of integrating schools. Any thoughts about that?
I think that would probably be certainly, again, historically speaking, you know, a lot of times the teachers unions, like they have not been like the bastions of like racial equity, you know, and so, and a lot of times like the teachers themselves were barriers to equity in schools as well. There was, again, like it was interesting at School for International Studies in the last few years. They had really put in a lot of work after that big influx of white families came in. There actually was, they got a new principal, and that probably made part of the difference, but there was like kind of like a big response and backlash to what had happened. And they started to put a lot of work into anti-racism and racial equity work that involved a lot of like parent groups and parent trainings, kid groups, but then a lot of it was focused on teachers and staff. It did seem like, you know, they were very, very committed to it. And it did seem like the kids said that they saw a difference. The kids themselves were a little skeptical as well of how long. They thought it was a bit faddish, and like, we're like, okay, I could see this kind of seems like the fad for right now, and we'll see how long this lasts. But they did overall see it like as progress was being made.
Mm-hmm. I know that part of the challenge and part of the responsibility of any plan is to make sure that we are all understanding the same nomenclature, the same terminology. So here, one group is saying that they're struck in the podcast by differences between equity, which they define as giving the same value to all kids' educational experiences, versus equality, all the same facilities. You want to talk about equity and equality and how that
I feel like you probably, Dr. Anderson, have way more to say about equity and equality. I feel like I have the basic understanding that I know that it is a constant wall of a thing for educators and has been talked about a lot in like the last few years, but maybe you would probably be better talking about it.
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, what strikes me most about all of these, I just got a signal that it's time to wrap up, but I think it's important for us to, you know, clarify terminology and all. And I just know that in looking through the literature about the integration plan, that I like to really see where the district is standing with respect to the whole understanding of inclusion. I know that it is a plan that is leaning towards the Berkeley model, an algorithm, but I would like to know how parity and inclusion it's going to manifest itself. And I think that also goes at the heart of equity, you know, and equality. All things are different. I think that there are students who have a variety of needs, and we just want to make sure that there is equity, you know, for the students in an inclusive environment. Certainly, the teachers need to be a part of this. The administration needs to be a part of this, and I think there really needs to be some very clear-cut differentiators here, and you know, a really well thought out plan as they go forth. Any final words for us, Julie? They keep telling me it's time to wrap up.
I am so appreciative that I'm so happy and appreciative that you guys have had me here tonight. And the fact that there are this many people that are ready to support an integration plan, but also already ready to talk about what more needs to be done, that's not the end of the line, that's the beginning steps, I think is really heartening. And I really appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And at this point, I'm going to turn the program over to Nancy Gagne, who is the Executive Director of the Coalition. Nancy, are you around?
I am right here. Thank you so much. I guess you can hear me because I suddenly lost the full screen. So, okay, because we're going back to the slides. Terrific. I first want to thank the schools committee for developing the idea and putting this out there. They talk about equity and integration, school integration, the achievement gap, talking to children about race, anti-racism training and cultural competency for teachers in our school district. And they've been doing this for many, many years. And this podcast, you know, was on a lot of our minds. I've known Julie for a long time, so it certainly was on my mind. It was perfect timing for us to bring this out. So thank you, Schools Committee, for organizing this, and to President's Council for coordinating with us and supporting this effort as well. Dr. Adni Anderson, who is a former trustee of the coalition, thank you for hosting.
Thank you.
Audrey and Tegan, for your grace and patience and work on the technical side of things. And I'm sure I'm going to leave people out, but I really do want to, I will not leave out Julie. Julie, this was fabulous. Thank you so much for your time and wisdom, both as a journalist and producer, and as a community member and a former Seth Boyden parent. You know, you bring so much to the table for us tonight, and I can tell from the comments in the chat that it really inspired a lot of important ideas, bringing some of those things to the surface for our community. I just want to mention that I hope to our audience that this met your personal goals for tonight, and our objective to get you to think more deeply about what educational equity and integration, what that means to you, what it may mean to your neighbors, your fellow community members, what it means to the entire community, and how we might achieve it so that all children have success in schools and so that it lasts. This is really what we're after: success for everyone and lasting success. We hope we are on that path. And at this moment, I know that we're going to be going to a survey, but before we jump into that, there are two things I need to share with you. One, you will see a slide momentarily about an upcoming event, Conversations on Race. It's an annual event. We always have a speaker. This year it's Jesse Hagopian, who is an activist, a teacher. He has worked a lot with Black Lives Matter, and he will be talking to us about racial justice in education. That's April 29th. I really hope that people here will sign up for that. I also need to remind you that we are a 501c3, and we do rely on individual donors and mostly community donors to do what we do. So I did post in the chat our donate page, and we also now have text to donate. So you can just text CCR Give to the phone number that is in the chat. And if you didn't catch it, it's 202-858-1233. It's up there again. Thank you, Shana, for reposting that. So a lot coming up, and I hope you will stick with us and do our survey. I don't know who I'm turning that part over to.
That would be Jocelyn. And I would just remind everybody, please, it's just 3 minutes, but one of the questions is, do you want to continue this conversation? So please have a look at the survey.
And yes, the survey is now in the chat, and you can link right out to it.
Yes. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. And thank you to the Schools Committee. And thank you to the Coalition for a wonderful evening. Thank you.